Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Mark Little. I'm the Executive Director of the Create Center at UNC Chapel Hill and co-chair of the Black Communities Conference for Collaboration. I'm joined by conference co-chair Carla Slocum, who is also Director of the UNC Institute of African American Research and Professor in the UNC Department of Anthropology. Welcome to the second session in our webinar series on Black communities and COVID-19. This webinar series is an outgrowth of the Black Communities Conference, which was created to foster collaboration among Black communities and universities. Our webinars stay true to this mission by focusing on community and scholarly research perspectives on the pandemic. During last week's webinar, we discussed health disparities in COVID-19, and today we're going to talk with community leaders in Toronto, Canada, North Charleston, South Carolina, and Houston, Texas. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom chat to pose questions for the panel. My co-chair will be looking through those, and in the second half of today's conversation, she's going to be bringing those up, and the panelists will be responding and discussing them. We'd also like to hear your anecdotes about the impacts of this crisis in your community and on community development in other Black communities. So to get things kicked off, let me introduce our panelists. Omar Mohammed is the Executive Director of Low Country Alliance for Model Communities, or LAMC. It's a nonprofit organization founded for the purpose of advocating environmental justice and promoting community development, education, employment, quality housing, and community involvement for several distinct communities in the North Charleston area. LAMC works to empower residents to actively participate in initiatives to improve the quality of life of their communities. Omar and his organization were presenters at the 2019 Black Communities Conference. Next, we have Secunda Joseph, who is a co-founder of Imagine Noir and Black Lives Matter Houston, Texas, or BLMHTX. Imagine Noir and BLMHTX were formed in 2015 is a Black women-led local collective of academics, activists, artists, and religious leaders and community organizers that aims to educate, empower, and build coalition in order to address issues that impact Black lives in the city of Houston. Their mission is to spark critical visions of a world where Black lives matter while we work to address some of the concerns toward making this a reality in Houston. Secunda and Imagine Noir co-founder Brandy Holmes were presenters at the 2019 conference as well. And then lastly, but not leastly, we have Simone J. Smith. She's chief reporter for the Toronto Caribbean newspaper and host of two programs on MyTCN TV. One of the programs is called In the Now, and it's a show focused on delivering relevant news stories from around the world, as well as giving you a behind the scenes look into the lives of successful Africans living in Africa and throughout the diaspora. Her other show is called Here to Help You, and it's devoted to educating, empowering, and elevating Africans living in the diaspora, particularly in the African and Caribbean communities in Canada. Simone featured the 2019 Black Communities Conference on her program In the Now. All right, so the way we're gonna do this is I'll have a few questions for all the panelists, and I'll call out the name of the panelists to kind of direct those. And then we have some questions that are for individual panelists. But as I was saying at the beginning, really want this to be very interactive. So all the participants, please, as you think of questions, as you think of what's going on in your community, please use the Q&A function to send those to us. So I'll direct this first question that will be for all of you, but maybe we could start with Simone. You interact with a broad range of people in your community. What are the most common concerns that you have been hearing since this crisis began?
I think probably one of the number one, first of all, before I start, thank you, Mark, for having me on. Thank you, Carla. And I want to say hello to all the panelists, representing, of course, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. For us in Toronto, I think one of the biggest things has been just an adjustment. People getting out of their normalcy and moving into what is now considered quarantine. With that comes obviously a host of problems. There's mental health issues. There's a lot of challenges with parents when they're dealing with their children because now everything has gone online. Some parents are resistant to that. In Canada or in Toronto itself, we're a very multicultural city. So we have a lot of immigrants. So this transition has been very hard for them too, because a lot of these parents don't speak English, right? They're new here, and they may have 4 or 5 children, and they're unable to help these children the way they would like to, because really and truly, as much as the school boards are trying, they're not really giving or providing the needs, or providing for the parents and the students' needs. So it's been very difficult in that aspect. And of course, financially, it's a problem. Yes, we're getting some help from the government, which is great, but there's a large percentage of our population, obviously Black, and a lot of the Native Indians and indigenous communities up here that are suffering, because a lot of our Black women and Black men are frontline workers, and they're not being equipped with the things that they need. So there's a large amount of things. I'm sure a lot of these you'll hear repeatedly from some of the other panelists, but I'm not gonna say we have it bad, but we don't have it great either.
Thank you. Secunda, maybe how about in Houston?
Houston, I think one of the first things that sort of jumped out, which is something you heard across the nation, was the concern for our folks who were already incarcerated. Houston has one of the largest, well, Harris County has one of the largest jail systems in the country, right? And many of those folks, of course, I mean, they're in there to pretrial that they haven't necessarily been found guilty or haven't been convicted of a crime. And the concern for those who were like in a space that is not set up for any type of social distancing. In addition to that, we have a huge homeless community here in Houston. And, you know, 4 years ago now, I think Harvey hit, and at the same time where like housing, financial benefits for housing, federal benefits were cut, right? So you had people who needed a place to stay, right? You had communities that are being gentrified that, like, when disasters hit, like that, it's just a great opportunity for folks who have been looking for, you know, a way to get rid of these, you know, buildings. They may be low income, rent is more affordable and cheaper. Like, you've seen a lot of those places disappeared. So you have folks in the margin. I think one of the most interesting things that I said that I saw that caught my eye was folks who live in hotels, right? Who are living in hotels. And unlike other places, one of the things that happened in Harris County, immediately, very quickly, I'll say that there was like, hey, we're not gonna do any evictions, right? After about a week or two of folks saying, hey, we need to pay attention to things. But folks who have been living out of hotels, like, there's no, you have sort of no grace, right? And we got calls. We were getting calls from folks saying, hey, like, can you help us? Me and my kids are getting put out. Like, what can we do? And then you had other people who were like, hey, yeah, I mean, I can't get evicted, but if I can't pay my rent for 2 or 3 months, like, what's gonna happen then? So I think those are some of the larger, or most common concerns, you know, on top of people really needing supplies and, you know, things like that.
Right. Omar, how about in North Charleston, or just the, you know, general Charleston area?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share what we are doing here in North Charleston. Some of the concerns that we're hearing right now is around reliable information about COVID and how can communities protect themselves. So there's a lot of misinformation that is in the community. So being able to combat, you know, that misinformation and provide reliable information to the community has been, we've been seeing increased conversations around that. Also, disparities. This health crisis has highlighted disparities that has been happening, particularly in Black and Brown communities, for generations. and conversations now, not only with health inequities and health disparities, but also disparities when it comes to technology. Who has access to certain technologies when it comes to the ability to have internet for your child to be able to continue their classwork. Older individuals not having access to the proper technology which allows them to continue to be connected to their community or continue to participate on boards and committees that they serve on. We have found that those are barriers and challenges right now. And then of course, testing. People are really concerned about when is testing going to occur in their community so that they have a better kind of understanding of the impact of this virus and where it is.
Right. And maybe Omar, let me just follow up with another question for you. What kind of economic and employment impacts are you seeing?
Yeah, so in our communities, we work in low wealth communities, and they're already on the fringes of being displaced. There's not a lot of economic opportunities, employment opportunities in those communities. So when COVID or other type of events such as COVID happens, these communities suffer more from those impacts. So what we're seeing is minority businesses. Some of them they may not recover. If some of them open, they may have to reduce their operations or reduce how many stores they open. So this is a real concern for our organization. And one of the responses to address that, LAMPC is pivoting its micro loan program. So we had a micro loan program that we instituted about 2 years ago. We're pivoting that program to target minority businesses that are impacted by COVID-19. And what we're doing is that we are partnering with other local organizations who want to expand that program. So other organizations that underwrite loans, and because we have to face realities that minority businesses probably will not get the federal aid that is coming down from Washington, D.C., from all other type of federal aids that happen after disasters. If it follows that pattern, minority businesses more likely will not have access to those fundings. So LAMPC wanted to take the approach of, we have this money here, let's pivot that program specifically targeting minority businesses.
Secunda, maybe in Houston, thinking about the employment and business impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been hit, like there's been two punches. So you have, of course, you have folks that are shut down. And I mean, there are a lot of, thinking in terms of Black and brown folks, right? Outside of the essential workers who are like putting their bodies on the line daily. You have Houston is an oil city, right? Our downtown buildings are filled with folks who work in the energy business. And even, the suburbs are filled with, there's been huge investments and planned on being huge investments in this industry, right? That's why people are here. That's why Black folks all over the US move to Houston, oftentimes because of these opportunities. Well, you see, I think maybe 2 to 3 weeks into this, Halliburton, which hires thousands of folks in the city of Houston, they laid off thousands of people immediately. That's something that happened very early on. And then you had other folks who are, a lot of Black and brown folks who work downtown and who work in areas where you have a lot of the business professionals or whatever, but they support these different professionals. You have chefs, you have folks who come. I have few friends who are like dancers and work as yoga instructors, right? Who have contracts with these folks, right? So you see all of that stopped. And just, the same things that's happening across of the nation. I think I read something that said that like 50% of Houston's normal like economic output has stopped, right? And if I look around, if I look in my community, you know, it is the barbers, it's the again, the artists, the creatives. Like, I think if there's anything where there's been like a mass hit for those folks, that has been one of the hardest hit industries, or hardest hit groups of people.
And Simone, in Toronto, I know you mentioned a little bit about frontline workers in the Toronto area. Maybe talk about what's the impact on folks outside of that space, and then also on Black-owned businesses.
Okay, so I think for everyone this is global, how things are affecting all of us. So a lot of the stories are the same. I can definitely give Omar and Sukunda, there's a lot of loss. Businesses, small, new, even large businesses everything's at a standstill. No one can do anything right now. And I think one of the biggest things that hit home for them is the fact that we have to realize now that there is no going back to normal. There's no normalcy that we know of, the ones that we were used to. There's no normal. And it's been adjusting and figuring out for a lot of these businesses how to adjust from pre-COVID to how it's going to look post-COVID. And it's panic because it's new, it's changed. And it's difficult to deal with. Everyone knows this. So a lot of the businesses right now are just trying to wrap their heads around how things are going to look for them. And for, like Omar was saying, a lot of these businesses are not going to open, or if they do open, they may not last. They're going to have to cut down to bare minimum. And it's chaotic. It definitely for the business is chaotic. We do have a lot more help financially. I will say that in Canada. The government is rolling out a lot of programs for new businesses and for small businesses. They're rolling out loans. Now, a lot of these might be to our detriment in the future, but right now, money is allowing us to function, but not at 100% like we used to. Being in the news industry and obviously working with advertisers, something that we've done, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little later, is we've been prepping the businesses that we work with a post-COVID plan. And again, I'm not going to go into that too much because I have a feeling we're going to hit there in a bit, but we've been doing that because we realize that people have been in a tailspin, and we've taken it as our responsibility, working so closely with the community, that we have to aid them in just getting past this spiral and getting into thinking about how we're going to survive and thrive when this is done.
Right.
Can I add something?
Please.
So one of the things after the stimulus package plan was released, right? And you had folks who understood that they would be filing for unemployment here. People who would normally be eligible for it, like a lot of, frankly, a lot of Black folks who are independent, small business owners, but really like in business for themselves, a group of the folks that we talked about earlier. For at least a month, I'm gonna say maybe last week or maybe the week prior, like people were not able to get through the lines, right? They were not able to even file the application. It was just like, it was stuck. So I started asking people, like, have you been able to get through? And just now, like you hear people, and I'm not saying no one like, has received unemployment or anything yet. I don't know. I didn't do the data, right? But from what I've been hearing, like most of the folks that I've talked to or that we've asked, like people are just getting to the point to where, okay, yes, I'm eligible, or I'm not eligible, or I'm eligible for the disaster benefits, right? But not necessarily having that income in yet. So, and today, like in Houston, we're so safe. In Texas, we're opened up, right? And then there's a lot of concern about that for us as well. But
okay.
Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone who's all the participants, attendees, please use the Q&A function at the bottom to ask questions and also comment. So for example, If you have a story or anecdote about some of the economic and employment impacts that are being felt in your community, or you know some other concerns that you're hearing in your community since this crisis started, please just type those in, and we'll bring those back into the conversation a little later. So let me just go ahead and start kind of digging down a little bit into each of these communities to hear some more. So let me start with Omar. Where have you been in the organization been spending the majority of your effort since the crisis hit?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of our effort has been focused on partnership expansion. So looking for ways in which we can expand our partnership and leverage the resources that we already have, as well as identify resources that we can use for COVID response. Like, for example, we found a foundation that is interested in a proposal we put together to develop community-based mutual aid networks, basically where communities take the lead on how they respond to different events in their community. So beyond what COVID, the impact of COVID, in Charleston, particularly the coastal areas, we're coming upon hurricane season. So with COVID, and then the realities of what's going to happen if potentially we have a hurricane land in the Charleston area, that's going to be added stress on the system, added stress on communities. So how can communities be resilient to these different types of changes? So helping communities develop these mutual aid networks is something that we are really doing extensive research on, and seeing how we can fund that and help communities establish those. So that's primarily where our focus is, in addition to the other things that we do, but we are doing a lot of activity around these developing community mutual aid networks.
So, Simone, I know a couple of weeks ago you were posting some pictures on Instagram. It looked like maybe it was a food drive or something like that you were participating in. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that particular effort and the need that you're trying to meet, and maybe some of the other specific activities that you've helped to get started?
Of course. So before I do this, I want to talk about something that I think we need to think about as a global community for the future. And it's that in January, because I'm so attached to media and I'm always getting a lot of information, I knew about COVID, and I started speaking about this mid-January. I was doing shows about it. If anyone's interested in some of the stuff that I was talking about then, I was doing it right through until panic hit in March. And what I'd actually done at the beginning of March is I reached out to the Toronto leaders in our community, and I put together a community release, and I said, listen, the storm is coming, and we need to start preparing for our community. We need to start getting food together, because we already know that at the tail end of a lot of things, it is us. So I put this out to the leaders, and I said, listen, if you guys have anyone who has a building, who has a space, let's start putting food together. Let's start putting non-perishables together. Let's start putting diapers, toothpaste, everything. Let's start doing this. And I was met with silence. And unfortunately, that just seems to be how we are in a lot of ways. As a community, we are not very proactive. We're very reactive. And it's always after catastrophe hits that we want to try to scramble and pick up pieces, which is why I think for us, we are in the position that we are right now. This is why when I put this out there and I got no response, I was a little bit disheartened, and I kind of pulled back. I actually had a community leader say to me, you know what, Simone, you're a journalist. You should probably just stay in your lane and not worry about this. Like, it's too soon. Stop. Don't worry. I think you're overthinking this. And then panic hit 2 weeks later, and I was like, overthinking. Okay, now here we are, and a lot of our community is suffering. So what I've done now is I've joined with other organizations and some restaurants in the city, and we are actually getting food, which we are handing out and delivering to people who are disabled. Homeless people are getting food from us. Single mothers who have a lot of children and can't leave their homes. We are going to them. We've opened up a space. We have a restaurant called Spice It Up in Scarborough, Ontario, and we've actually opened up that space, and we've given people time to come down and pick up food. The store owner's been very kind. She's giving away free food as well. Now, I think that this is happening in a larger scale in Toronto now. I'm starting to see community leaders do it now, but I'm like, it's kind of late. And my hope after this is that in the future, we start really setting plans up. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. The 5 Ps. We need to start doing this way ahead of time and start listening sometimes to when people are talking to us about what's going on, so we're better prepared for catastrophes. Omar, you were just talking about hurricane season coming up. So what you're doing is perfect. The fact that you're starting to prepare ahead of time, because we don't always want to be reacting and then asking the government to help us. As a community, I think we have to start helping each other better and preparing in advance. And I think that's the one thing that I've been disappointed with leaders in Toronto, is that not a lot of people have actually acted, they reacted. And now everyone's scrambling and asking the government to help out. And it's like, guys, we have a huge community here. Why are we not doing this for ourselves? I can't hear Mark.
Mark, you muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Gotcha. Sorry about that. Simone, you mentioned earlier about how the broader community in Toronto is very diverse, but also the Black communities in Toronto are very diverse. And we have first-generation immigrants from the Caribbean, from Africa, as well as communities with generational roots in Canada. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this crisis has impacted the relationships and interactions among these different communities.
You know what? I think obviously there's been some unification, because we're really all in the same boat right now, so we don't have a choice but to unify and help each other. But I don't know if it's enough. I'm reaching out. I'm actually working with another group in Windsor, Ontario, and they've actually reached out to me to start doing programs here in Toronto out there. So I think now, if anything, a lot of the networks are starting to come together. Out of all different, so first generational Caribbeans, Africans, and obviously the people who've been here, the Canadians who are actually here and been here for a long time. We're now starting to reach out to each other and interact more and try to figure out ways to get through this together.
Secunda, welcome back. A question for you. So I've been trying to follow just general news as much as I can tolerate. But it's been interesting to me. You know, Houston is the 4th largest city in the U.S., and it seems like there hasn't been much of any national coverage on the impact of COVID-19 in Houston. And so just generally, like, how are you feeling about the situation in your city? And just any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that seems to happen often. So some way, a lot of times what's happening in Houston, very little do you find it on the national news. Houston is very connected to Louisiana, New Orleans, of that type of, those folks. So oftentimes, like, if you see something impacting, one of those cities, because of the way that we're interconnected, like, surely it's sort of moving this way. There had been a lot of concern about Houston, just like everywhere else, like COVID has hit like African-American communities, has had a much larger impact. Although we make up, I think Harris County is like 20% of African Americans are in Harris County, and like 40% of the cases or in the Black community. As a matter of fact, our current mayor, Sylvester Turner, he, born and raised in a neighborhood called Acres Home. Acres Home is one of the hardest hit communities impacted by COVID. Texas has very little testing. I think in Texas, period, you have seen that there's been less tests than anywhere else, almost in the nation. And not only is Houston a huge community, Texas is a big state, right? So it's very hard to know exactly where we are. So what do we know? Like, we know that, like, Black folks know Black folks who have been impacted by COVID. Black folks know Black folks who have been in the hospitals, been in ICU with COVID, right? Scarface, very popular hip hop artist, was one of the first, I think, to talk about being impacted with COVID. I think one of the things that people focus on a lot is how many folks died, right? Are people dying? Which is very important, is the worst thing. But this man now, after coming in contact with COVID, is now on dialysis, right? So you have people who are living, right, who have made it through ICU, but their health is impacted, right, in a way. So I think those are some of the concerns. The major concern right now, especially for me and a lot of folks, is like, if there hasn't been enough testing, there's not enough tracing. We're opening up today. Yesterday was one of the Texas lost more folks than they've ever lost, like statewide, right? How are we gonna open up if we really don't know where we are, right? So that's been a huge concern. And you see Black business owners, like, there are a couple, one of the most popular places in Houston right now, Turkey Leg Hut, right? Black folks love Turkey Leg Hut. It's a dope restaurant, right? But there's been concern because they're like, okay, we're gonna open up. And then you may contrast to another Black-owned restaurant. Marcus Davis owns a few of the places that brings a lot of Black joy to the city, the Breakfast Club or whatever. And he was just like, we're gonna try to take our time, right? Because we are concerned about like our city and we really don't know, right? So you see business owners, Black business owners making tough decisions because we don't know a lot, right? We don't know what's gonna happen next week. There is testing sites that are opening up more and more in the city, in our communities, but where we at right now, we really don't know. We don't have the research, we don't have the testing, and we don't have the folks who are like connecting the dots on who's been affected, and how many people have they been in contact to. I read something yesterday that says, this is my last point, if one person has been infected with COVID, then it's likely that they came in contact with like 20 people, right? So, but if there's no like tracing, at this point, we don't know. So
Kunda, maybe one follow-up for you. I know a couple of times you've mentioned getting information from other people in the community. Last week, the webinar we hosted was on sort of just disparate health impacts. One of our panelists was a mental health advocate. And a lot of the questions from panelists at that time were about how to get information from community members when you're trying to quarantine, all these different things. So maybe just talk a little bit about actually, how are you actually hearing from community members, and what kind of networks have been set up to relay information amongst the community?
There's a few things. There is, well, one, when Harvey hit Houston, out of a lack of response to historically Black communities where things were hit worse. And again, you see no news coverage. I mean, you didn't even see the fire department there, right? BLMHTX, us, and other Black-led organizations came together and we responded, right? We created, basically we were like, what we need to do, clean these houses, muck these houses, call folks. So being in those communities over time, which I think, you mentioned like what was going on in South Carolina, like folks are still rebuilding from Harvey. Like for those communities, those people are still some years behind. Some floors are not fixed. Some kitchens are not what they're supposed to be, right? The economic impact from that is still being felt in those communities. So still being in relationship with those folks, right? That is one way that we're able to hear from folks. We had a hotline for folks to call in if they needed help and assistance. And then we would bring tools or resources. At that time, it was like cleaning supplies and, things to get the mold and the muck and the water out your home. So those people have been calling and saying, hey, this is what's going on with us. Do you need help, right? And then we have other folks that we're in coalition with, right? who we speak with, who also have relationships and different folks within a community. And then I think lastly, it is old school, like calling, what have you been doing? How are y'all doing? Just really being in community. I think it's really hard to know what's happening if those relationships are not already built. But because we have those relationships, and then for us, it is also like getting information out. So we do a podcast called The Relay and a show on Sundays. Like this Sunday, I had the opportunity to speak with a show called Imagine the World. Like a few folks came in on Instagram because we're not on the radio no more, right? When quarantine, we did a live, and ministers, small business owners, other organizers, folks just called in and talk about like where they were, right? How COVID was affecting their community. So those are the ways we have been getting information and then also like getting stuff out.
Just again, another reminder for folks who are listening in, please contribute your questions and feedback in the Q&A function. I just got a couple more questions, maybe one for Omar, one for Simone, before we switch over to some of the panelists' questions and feedback. So for Omar, obviously, you know, Charleston area has a long history of racial violence, including the 2015 Emmanuel Massacre, Emmanuel AME Church Massacre, as well as the police murder of Walter Scott. I'm wondering if you've been thinking at all about how this reality has impacted how Black folks are viewing the current crisis, or how communities and organizations are responding to this new crisis.
Yeah, so what we have been seeing and having conversations around is how inequities in communities can be addressed. We have seen some shift in local philanthropic conversations where they are now starting to develop endowments that address inequities, not only racial inequities, but now they're adding health and other types of inequities that exist in communities. We're starting to see conversations at the state level and the local level about policies to deal with housing inequities and rent control and inclusionary zoning and policies around foreclosure prevention and eviction prevention types of conversations. That is the shift in conversations that we're starting to see. At the academic level, we're actually seeing students now taking the interest in helping organizations address inequities. For example, we have College of Charleston students who are working with organizations to map what inequities look like. Before, that never happened. Now you have college students who have this skill set, and they want to be helpful in some way. So they are lending their technical backgrounds to be able to make cases for policy. And one of the things that we are having a conversation with our local state environmental and health agency is how can they, because right now, the Trump administration and EPA, well, not EPA, but the Trump administration is trying to roll back environmental protection that EPA can enforce. And they're using COVID to do it. So that means that Black and brown communities who are environmental injustice communities, they are going to face more environmental harms on the decision of the Trump administration to roll back these enforcement laws that EPA enforce. Air quality, water quality, those types of standards. So being able to have policy in place and ensuring that your state agency will enforce state environmental laws, that is a conversation that we are having with our state agency about continuing to enforce those state laws to ensure that the health and environment at the local level is being protected. Although the federal cannot do it, it falls on the state to maintain. So those are the conversations that we're starting to see happen in communities. We're also seeing agencies who normally do not do, like for example, food response. We're starting to see them do that. So, like I said, the state agency that's responsible for kind of the health and environmental laws in the state, they actually connected chicken farmers with communities in rural areas of South Carolina, and that connection was so successful, it shut down Interstate 26 because there was so many cars that wanted to have access to that food. So that's what I mean about agencies taking a active role in ensuring that communities who do not have access to food or do not have access to hand sanitizer, that they use the networks and the connections that they have to ensure that those communities have that. We had the state transportation department. They had a vendor who had hand sanitizer. There was a community, a rural community again, who were asking for hand sanitizer. They were able to connect this community with that vendor, and hand sanitizer were able to was able to be deployed to that community. So these are examples of shifting agencies to be able to use their networks to help communities.
And Simone, just quickly before we switch over to the participant questions, any comments or perspective on if or how Black voices in Toronto are being heard by the Toronto government or Ontario or the Canadian federal government?
Okay, so yeah, I actually pulled a list of names before I came on because although it might be reactory, we are still now seeing more. So Black Legal Action Center is speaking out for homeless people who are in the homeless shelters, where right now the whole idea of social distancing is not being honored. And of course, a lot of homeless people in our city happen to be Indigenous or Black, and they are catching COVID at a very high rate. So Black Legal Action Center has put together a coalition to speak to the government directly to Premier Doug Ford and to say, look, we need you to match your actions and your words. Also, the Ontario Alliance of Black School Educators is also doing the same thing. They're actually pointing out certain school boards and saying, okay, look, you need to step it up. You need to make sure that our children are not going to fall behind, because realistically, a lot of our students right now are behind. And we're going to be going into a new year. I was speaking to someone about this yesterday. Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to push these children forward? Because if you do, our children are in a lot of trouble. You can't push someone who barely got a grade 6 to finish their grade 6 into grade 7. They're missing some huge things. So do you keep them back or push them forward? So there's a lot of talk about what's happening with our education system. The Ontario Health Coalition is also talking about collecting race data. So that's another thing that's coming up a lot, is the idea of collecting race-based data to find out exactly how impacted the Black community is by COVID. CTO are also doing things with other organizations. So CTO has a podcast called The Unwanted Visitor. And what they're doing is they're actually speaking to the Caribbean diaspora, people who live in Toronto, anywhere in the Caribbean, and they're offering suggestions on how we can move forward, again, looking at pre-planning, looking at things past this, because we're almost at the end of this. A lot of people don't realize it. It may get a little bit touchy, but we're almost at the end, so we have to start planning now. And parents of Black children, again, outspoken, they're out of York, Ontario. They also are speaking up about how the school systems are supporting our children. Our NDP, which is the opposition to the Conservative here in Canada, they are speaking up again, asking why things are not being done, why we're not collecting race-based data, how we're really helping out our frontline workers, how we're helping out our homeless community, how we're helping with our seniors, how are we feeding our people. There is some push. There's definitely some push. And the government has no choice, because I'm in the media and I'm going to push it. So they're going to hear it. No one wants any bad press right now. So right now, everyone wants to be my best friend. So the government is hearing. Believe me, they are.
Thanks, all of you. These have been great remarks so far, and we do have a number of questions. I'd like to jump in with some of them. One of the things that you've actually brought up, Simone, is about the reaction, that people have had this kind of reactive response to things. And so there have been a number of comments and questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom here. And some of the comments have talked about crisis-related research that actually says that it is typical that it takes 1 to 2 months for a community to actually be able to respond to a situation like that. And so so there are a number of comments, but one person has actually asked the question, are there steps that the community can take to be better prepared for future crisis situations like this one? For instance, many essential workers in the grocery stores, transit industry, et cetera, are from Black and brown communities. Should we advocate for hazard pay for these workers in crisis time? So speak a little bit more about the way that people can be more prepared. You suggested that you had jumped in early and tried to get people to get on board to be prepared. So tell us some of your thoughts about better ways to get prepared.
Okay, I think one of the first things that we have to start doing together, I don't know how it is in a lot of the other cities in the States, or in the States, are like what's happening out there. But in Toronto, a lot of our groups and our organizations are very detached. So everyone's kind of doing their own thing, but no one doing the same thing. We're not connecting the dots. And I think one of the first things we have to do once all of this has settled down is we need to really stop. The leaders in our community need to stop. We need to really get together and say, okay, look at what happened here. What are we going to learn from this for the future? Because this is not going to be the first or last crisis that we as a people have to deal with. So honestly, unfortunately, not all of us, and I'm saying I have to speak to the leaders, because some people just don't have the ends or the ability to do more than what they're doing. And we can't expect that from them. But if you have a platform, and if you are calling yourself a leader, you need to start really dropping some of that ego and learning to work with other people to figure out what we need to do for those who cannot do for themselves. And that was my whole point when I put this out there, is like, look, we may not think it's a big deal now. Nothing's a big deal until it happens. And then when it happens, it's a big deal. But we now know what can happen if we sit back. So really, I call out all leaders. Leaders need to start working together a lot more. We need to start looking at things, and yes, on paper, we need to start seeing, how do we plan for the future? How can we as organizations work together to make sure that we are servicing our communities? It's work. It is. It's going to take a shift in perspective for a lot of us leaders. It's going to take you having to maybe not be the person who's always calling the shots. It's okay, because it's not about you. And we have to realize when crisis hits, it hits everybody. COVID has hit everyone at all levels. Doesn't matter what money, what you own, what position you have, it's going to hit. But you can't always just be thinking about yourselves. And as much as, yes, it's okay to be selfish at times in a time like this and in crisis in the future, we need to start really working together a lot more and getting rid of all this, well, I'm doing this here and I'm doing this here, because it's not enough, because our people are still suffering. So I don't know. We need to talk to them about this.
So Kunda and Omar, you're both from cities that have had significant crises, national crises. Can you speak to this kind of question too, about preparedness and about being prepared, and any lessons that you've seen from what you've experienced in either Charleston or Houston?
I think I just first want to give gratitude to so one of the things that I've learned as, beginning to get out there and organize more was that in some cities they have folks what you would call the conscious community, right? And then you have this political group, and you have these different groups. But in the 80s and 90s, a few of the folks within the city of Houston who had the time and the energy to organize in the city, and it means people from the Nation of Islam. There's I'm gonna call it the Shrine of Black Madonna, which was really huge in Detroit. They had a huge community also in the city. There were a few folks from Black Catholic churches, which is what I was raised up in, and even folks who were on the city council. A lot of these people with different perspectives joined together, that's all I ever knew, right? And created these coalitions, right? So for us, when this Black Power movement, or this, you know, other emerging, because Black folks have always been fighting for liberation, right? So when folks began to move again, you know, in as like the Black Lives Matter movement, like those relationships was already there, right? That was already constructed. So it wasn't really difficult for us to show up at a place, other groups, other folks show up at a place, and for us to say, oh yeah, we building coalition, because that groundwork had already been done, right? And just understanding, and you know, like you said, Simone, like the central thing is like, what can we do to serve? What can we do to make this better for all of us? And acknowledging that our people have the tools that they need to do what it is that they need to do. Sometimes people need resources. Sometimes they, you know, whatever, we all have something to offer, but you know, all of us are leaders. All folks can lead themselves, right? We just need assistance. We need help. So like just being in positions where just having an understanding of that and being willing to do the work and being willing to like not give up. But if there was anything I would say relationship. Like the same things that your grandmothers taught you, what your mothers taught you, like look out for other people, call and see what's happening. For example, like, you know, we talk about the digital divide. When we had some years ago, there was like this coalition, there was like this gang injunction that happened in Houston where a lot of folks were affected, a lot of young Black men. One of our greatest partners working with this was a group of folks who meet like all over the city. They're mostly over 60 and 70 years old. They're very organized, right? But they're not on the internet. They're not doing any of that, right? But a few of the folks, right, who are part of this organization, we were in relationship with, right? So they got information out in a way that they did it, right? And we did what we needed to do, but we continue to talk, right? And we continue to build, and together, you know, we're able to get work done. And when something happens like this, and you know, like you say, there's always something, like it's nothing to pick up the phone and say, hey, you know, what's going on? How can we help? Like it's, I mean, the stuff our grandmothers taught us, like that's how you build. Oftentimes you see folks who are like creating lists and thinking about these numbers, and like I think being adaptable, reaching out and having the greatest, like the community center, whatever is the greatest good for the most of us, is how you like prepare and how you build.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question that hasn't come up so far about young people. And so someone has asked, how do we actually reach young people? Young people and millennials who are not watching news, and many don't seem to take it seriously. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Are you seeing anything about younger generations that you think are distinct about them not getting the information?
Can I speak on that?
Sure, Simone.
Okay, so that was actually one of the things, and again, because we've been preparing for this, I work with, again, one of the largest Caribbean media sources in Canada right now. And one of the things we've actually done is we've connected with young writers. We have writers as young as 11 years old. And what we're doing with them is we're allowing them to speak to their audience, to their cohort. So I have two students in high school, both who, and I just say to them, I say, listen, we don't understand, like I can't understand what's happening with you. And I'm sure there's a lot of things that your friends are saying. You need to speak to them. They're not going to hear if an adult talks. They don't care what we have to say. But coming from one of their peers, they may hear it. So we've brought on younger writers to write directly to their cohort, to speak to them, offer words of advice, offer wisdom, gather information. You know, one of the articles in my last edition that we put out was just an article just on what young people are going through, some of the mental health illnesses, the fact that some of them are in abusive homes. And we don't think about things like that. And this type COVID is terrible for them because a lot of these students, the streets is a safer place for them, but they can't even go out. Now they're stuck in abusive, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological situations, and no one, listen, in Canada right now, the domestic violence rates have skyrocketed. And you have young people in these homes going with no outlet. So we had to find a way to give them that. So that's what we did. I just said, look, we need young people. We need to hear from them. And we need to let them know that even if they don't want to talk to us as adults, at least there's someone who can get their message out to the larger public.
Great. Omar, we have a question specifically for you. Someone wants to know if it'd be possible for you to expand more on the proposal and the partnership allocation you're doing. How has that process been? And have they been successful? And what are your challenges in doing the proposal and community leadership responses?
Okay, that's a really good question. So just like what Simone and Secunda have said prior, is that relationship building, network coalition building is important to the work that we do. In addition to that, this works because what we are trying to address, the communities have identified. And then we use our organization and the networks that we have formed to address those issues and concerns. So one, we ensure that what we are doing addresses the needs in the community. It's not something that we identify as a need, but it's something that the community has said, this is a need that needs to be identified. So that's number one. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that we have to identify the right types of resources. So all funding is not good funding. So, some funding comes with strings attached. So you have to be able to say no to some funding and do not craft your proposal to fit a funding, but the funding should fit your proposal or whatever it is, a program that you're trying to find resources for. The third thing is that we also, as an organization, we have to diversify our funding and what that looks like. So we don't always depend on grants. We don't always depend on other organizations. We don't depend on cities and states to give us money, right? So what that looked like for us is that we set up endowments. And I think in the Charleston area, we're the first organization to establish endowments. And our endowments fund our work, the work that we do in the community. So that releases a lot of pressure off our organization to find any kind of funding. So that allows us to be very creative with our proposals, with partnerships that we align with networks that we form. And in that, we can truly address what the communities have identified. So specifically for the community mutual aid networks, what this is going to look like is that communities identify block captains. So each block in that community has one person that everyone on that block, that is the person that they go to for information, for supplies, for whatever it is that needs to be addressed on that block. Our organization will work with that block captain because it's difficult for us to work with 100 residents. We can work with 5 that is a block captain, that is a leader on their block. We can get resources to that one block captain that can be the repository for that block. The other thing that we do is that we share resources in our networks. So other people who join our networks have to align to our values. So when we bring in grants, we share the grant with our networks. For example, there's a group in Florence that we're working with. They have access to masks. We don't have access to masks. So what they're doing is they're sharing masks so that we can get masks out into our community. So that's what that looks like for partnerships and networks that we build. We rely on each other. We leverage each other's resources and networks and skill sets. And it has been a successful model for us. Actually, the proposal that we have written has gotten funded. We will be receiving $5,000 to begin the process of helping our communities establish these mutual aid networks. So, I mean, it works. It has to be authentic. It has to be community led. And our organizations have to be able to, like what Simone was saying, take the ego out of the process and take the back seat and allow the communities to drive the issue and the concern.
Okay, terrific. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but this has been a really great conversation with all of you. I want to thank all the panelists, Simone Smith, Secunda Joseph, and Omar Mohammed. Thank you also to the participants who signed on today and who contributed anecdotes from their communities and questions for the panel and your comments. Really regret that we weren't able to get to all of them, but we do thank you for your thoughtful comments. Next week's webinar is going to be on Black communities in COVID, arts and museums. We'll be looking at cultural and arts organizations and how they're dealing with the crisis. It's going to take place again on a Friday, next Friday at 10 a.m., and that will be on May 8th. And the panelists who we have featured for that are Jonelle Logan from Charlotte, North Carolina, who's the executive director of the League of Creative Interventionists and founder also of 300 Arts Project LLC. We also have Sunny Kelly, who is an actor, storyteller, motivational speaker, and PhD candidate in the Communication and Performance Studies Department at UNC Chapel Hill. And then lastly, we have Carl Just, who is in Miami, Florida, and he is a Miami Herald photojournalist and also an arts curator. If there are topics other than the ones that we've already outlined that we would like us to explore, please let us know. You can always email us at blackcommunities@unc.edu. We're also available on social media, on Twitter and at Instagram. Our handle is @blackcommunities, that's BLK Communities. And on Facebook, we are Black Communities, a conference for collaboration. I want to close out again by thanking the panelists. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank our behind the scenes team. We have working with us Cara Stith, who is with Create at UNC, and we also have Blake Robinson and Benita Ramsey, who are at the Institute of African American Research, also at UNC. So thanks again for a great webinar, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.